Welcome everyone to the member preview and curator lecture for Boris Lurie, Nothing to Do But to Try. This part of the lecture is actually being live streamed, so hello to our members who are watching from home. Yes, we do not have a microphone for this room, so we'll do our best to project and hopefully it'll get a little quieter once everyone takes their seats. Yes, and this is also being recorded with enhanced audio, so we can watch it later as well. So before we get started, I just want to thank everyone for your membership support. It's so great to finally meet some of you in person after all of our online programs and events this past year. Part of the reason that we're able to be here today is because of your membership support. So thank you so much for your dedication to the museum, for staying involved and engaged. We're so grateful. And today we are here to go behind the scenes of the exhibition with the curator, Sara Softness. Sara is an interdisciplinary curator and writer based in New York City with an academic background in European modernist visual culture and the history of photography. She has lectured and published widely and has held curatorial roles at the Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, the Guggenheim Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and most recently led the Walter Collection Project Space as Director of Exhibitions and Collections. She was also the 2020 Paris Photo Aperture Foundation Photography Catalog of the Year. And at the end of the lecture, we will save about 5 to 10 minutes for member Q&A, and we'll do our best to moderate the questions in the chat online and also in the room. So without further ado, welcome, Sara.
Thank you, Jory. Okay, I'm really going to try to project. Can everyone hear me? Yes. Okay, and if you can't, if I trail off, just let me know. I can do better. Okay, so echoing Jory's thanks for all of your being here. It's just been such a wonderful experience having worked on this exhibition, and now to get to interact with some of our members is just truly wonderful. And I mean, this backdrop, come on, it's so nice. Hello, everyone on live stream. I have to say hi to my grandparents, my Grandpa John and Grandma Cookie. I hope you can hear me. I hope you can see me. We'll figure it out later if not. All right, so I am thrilled to see this exhibition open. I know it's been a rough, almost coming on 2 years with not much programming here, so we are coming back up online with a really incredible exhibition that I'm just so privileged to have had the chance to work on. This exhibition examines the early life and early work of artist and Holocaust survivor Boris Lurie. Boris is best known, if he's known at all, really, as he was a radical mid-century artist, and he's known for about a decade of work that he did in the 1960s, part of the real avant-garde downtown scene. This exhibition is a reconsideration of his career and also of his biography. I think of this show as a portrait of a person, of an artist, of a survivor, and really of a human, and all of those challenges and complexities. This show really looks at Boris from the inside out. We had the incredible fortune to collaborate directly with the Boris Lurie Art Foundation, which is based just over the river in Clifton, New Jersey. Ordinarily, they're sending Boris's works all over the world to be shown in various exhibitions, so it was super great to just be able to go over there and pick out what we wanted to come back, and that's why we have such an extensive amount of things on view here in the exhibition. Boris endowed his own foundation. I'm going to talk about that a little later. He endowed his own foundation before his death. He was not a very successful artist in life, but he thought, what better way to ensure my success than by ensuring a legacy after he was gone? So I am really thrilled. Yesterday we heard at a press preview from the president of the Boris Lurie Art Foundation. He said, I'm sure that this would be, for Boris, the culmination of his life's work to get to show in the Museum of Jewish Heritage as a kind of portrait and through the lens of Holocaust remembrance, which was so unbelievably important to him and to his work and to his legacy. So here we go. So this show really focuses, as I said, it's a reconsideration on his early work. We are showing it in more depth than it ever has been shown before. This was the first work he made after liberation. I'm going to get more and more into his background, of course, and after emigrating to New York. Again, our setting is pretty perfect for that story. He kept the majority of the work that is in this show private during his life. He didn't think of it necessarily as his artwork, as his career's work. He thought of it likely in a very personal way. So again, this is a tremendous privilege to be able to show so much of it here as not only artwork, which it is fabulously well done as artwork, but really as this kind of emotional catharsis. So I want to start here with this kind of incredible quote that Boris wrote later in his life. The basis of my art education I obtained in a camp like Buchenwald. Oh no. We have a little bit of blockage, okay. Boris was not trained as an artist. He was incredibly gifted as an artist. And to me, this quote speaks of that, a lack of professional training, but also the ways in which his survivorhood, his survival of the Holocaust so informed who he was as a person and as an artist. Again, through the lens of Holocaust remembrance, this is a really fantastic place to be able to reevaluate him. So I'm going to run through a couple of family images while I speak about Boris's early life. Boris grew up in Riga, Latvia. His parents were Russian-born. He was actually born in Leningrad. He's adorable. I can't even. And in a very upper middle class family, both his parents were working. His mother was a dentist. His father was a businessman. He had two older sisters, Jana and Asya. And Boris was gifted early on. He studied German and English as he grew up, and he also spoke Russian, and he also spoke Latvian. So by the time he was 16, when the Nazis occupied, he was actually quadrilingual, which is pretty incredible. Here with his three sisters and his father. So a quite lovely childhood, in fact. He was 16 years old when the Nazis occupied Riga in 1941. He and his family were imprisoned in the Riga ghetto just about 3 or 4 months after occupation. By year's end, his mother, sister, grandmother, his sister Jana, grandmother, and his childhood sweetheart as well, were murdered alongside 25,000 other Latvian Jews in what was one of the largest mass executions carried out by the Nazi mobile killing units, the Nazi Einsatzgruppen. Boris and his father survived the rest of the war in a series of labor and concentration camps. And as I said, then they emigrated together, which was miraculous that they stayed together, frankly, and that they survived, emigrating to New York in 1946. So it is at that time that Boris puts pencil to paper and oil to canvas to begin reckoning with what he had just lived. He had not finished high school, and he had no profession. And then these works, again, which he kept private through his life, are at the center of our exhibition. So this body of work, you see two examples here, are now known as the War series. It's what his first body of work is called. And really, it's a visual testimony. We're all familiar with the way testimony has played into Holocaust remembrance, perhaps less so with visual than with oral. And it makes use of this type of language, a kind of convulsive visual language that creates a narrative of his experience, as well as an interpretation of it emotionally. Above all, for me, these works really access a deeply personal, wrenching, and occasionally very ambivalent space of grief, of guilt, of anger, that of course he dealt with his entire life. They're really spectacular images, many of them very hard to look away from, both for his artistic skill and for the weight that they carry. Principally in the show, we have drawings like the two I just showed you, of a really intimate scale, like ripped out of a notebook, it felt like, and then larger paintings or pastels. And he works both with these kind of incredible lines in a kind of quick fashion, as you can see, almost like a flashbulb memory or something, although also with quite a lot of technique. And then with these kind of bursting, riotous, unnatural colors to create a mood that is incredibly evocative in quite a haunting and nightmarish sort of way. So I'm going to speak about the exhibition as it unfolds. We have basically 5 semi-chronological sections, which you'll see when you visit the show. And as we move along, I wanted to do something a little different today, which is think about some frameworks or themes or 3 pillars that will help add some context and structure to the various kinds of material on view. So I wanted to pick, with alliteration, this is important to me, attestation, ambivalence, and advocacy. So what do I mean by that? So attestation, I attest that this happened, I'm bearing witness. That is something that these materials absolutely do. Ambivalence, they do an amazing job of expressing what is this incredible emotional weight, which is marked by, I feel, a lot of ambivalence. Obviously, he's happy he survived in some way, but the guilt and the doubt and the irresolution of what it felt like to really live his life in the wake of such horrible trauma is very much on view. And advocacy. We'll see later, Boris was an unbelievably dogged advocate for everything he believed in everything he wrote and researched and read, the way he set up his own foundation ahead of his death. He was committed, incredibly so, to remembrance of this event. So, starting with attestation, saying, bearing witness, saying this happened. So Boris and his family, as I mentioned, moved to the Riga ghetto in 1941. This is a really lovely small painting in the show, which depicts the Lurie's new apartment in the Riga ghetto, 37 Ludza Street. Just nearby this in the exhibition, and this I picked, in the exhibition I picked 4, here I'm showing you 3. Boris repeats this scene multiple times. I had to narrow this down. And this scene, as far as I can tell, seems to me to be, from this elevated perspective, perhaps Boris looking out of the window of this building and seeing a column of people being marched either to work or possibly on the death march to Rumbula Forest. Whatever it was obviously an indelible memory as he reproduced it multiple times. Here, this line of people, this photograph taken of Jews in the Riga ghetto, unclear exactly what year it's from. Boris always claimed that he was in this picture. I cannot verify that. And he never said who he was in the picture. But this was a picture he kept with him entirely for the rest of his life. Part of the research he did after the war to recover some of the happenings of his time there. I'm not sure how well you can see this, but this was another piece of research that Boris did. Here we have a photocopy from a book that Boris annotated. It was a map of the Riga ghetto, and you can see how deeply this was in 1992 at the earliest. All those many years later, he is mapping out and annotating exactly where all of these places were in the Riga ghetto. So this work, this work called Where They Passed, Torn Fence, Riga Ghetto, where the columns passed for execution. Often through the exhibition, what I do is pair the artworks, either through the wall labels or on their own, with quotations from Boris's memoir. He wrote a beautiful memoir in 1975 called In Riga, and it was truly an invaluable resource for putting this show together. It was, in his own words, both a historical chronicle of this moment, which does not have a lot written about it, and in Latvia, and obviously a very personal retelling and experience. So this quotation is one of the most heartbreaking that I remember and goes along with this painting. After the second large action on December 8th, and an action is a Nazi roundup or Nazi mass execution, the barbed wire at the far end of the ghetto complex remained cut open for several days. Our people had been led through there on their way to Rumbula. Now we walk through that very same spot of open fence as a shortcut to our work. Barbed wire cut open does not lead to freedom, but to death. So again, keeping in mind this kind of ambivalence, which comes up both visually and in his language, thinking about what this symbol should really have denoted something better than what it did. And coming back, and as the exhibition does too, is really a mixture here of historical documentation and Boris's kind of emotional interpretation or emotional documentation. So this is an image that I took from Yad Vashem's archives of prisoners being marched to Rumbula in December 1941. It's unclear, obviously it kind of has a surreptitious viewpoint here of somebody perhaps was not supposed to be documenting it. And there's very little information on this photograph, but it is quite a heartbreaking one. So this photograph was taken not at the Rumbula massacre, but at a massacre that happened just a week later in Liepāja, Latvia, by the dunes of the coast. This image is of Max Epstein and his sister Mia Malka, who are being forced to undress before being shot and laid to rest in mass graves. These photographs were taken by a German officer with the Einsatzgruppen named Karl Stratt. He stored the negatives in his home, and around 1943, I believe, a Jewish prisoner who was working for him named David Zvikon discovered the negatives in a desk drawer. He squirreled them out. He took them to someone who could reproduce them, which he did, and then he put them back. These were then used in the Nuremberg trials as evidence against the Nazis. There are many more photographs from this day, December 15th, 1941, that were part of this German officer's capture. Boris was absolutely transfixed by images like these. He there were no images of Rumbula, at least not that have been discovered, but I think he kept this image in particular very dear to him. This portrait of my mother before shooting, which is quite a heartbreaking title as well, was a work Boris made in 1947, like all of the work after the war. And this became his most prized possession and his most kind of favored piece of artwork, which he never showed. It just was for himself. And it was, of course, as you can see, and even more so in the exhibition, is just absolutely heartbreaking. So continuing in this pillar of attestation, kind of in a new section of the exhibition that looks at the way that the war series works, really bring you into Boris's experience in a pretty specific way. So as I mentioned, Boris and Ilya survived multiple labor and concentration camps, including a workshop in Riga nearby called Lenta, and then a boat transfer to Studhoff, and then to Buchenwald. Boris writes in his memoir about arriving to the concentration camp in Studhoff, having never actually been part of the true Nazi machinery, just in this kind of satellite camp previously in Latvia. And it was incredibly harrowing, of course. So both in paintings and in drawings, we have this kind of iconographic imagery of the prisoners in striped uniforms, the guards, the riots, the buildings. Something that I always take notice of in a lot of the drawings that we'll see is how often everyone's backs are turned in the compositions. I don't know, is there a laser on here?
The red line.
Oh, okay, great. With a few exceptions. So something to look out for as I show you more images and as you look in the exhibition. Here is the one face that looks out towards us with everyone else's backs turned, and here, of course, the backs turned as well. Once again, I like the way that this technique seems to have been erased pencil, the kind of this disembodying of this figure here. And then here you have what is this boat passage to Studhoff that he and his father were on, which he described as hellish, that, you know, that they had no idea where they were going. It was just, they were leaving Latvia and were unclear where to. So again, alongside the artistic work, I did some research in archives that turned up what were Boris's prisoner cards. And again, in Studhoff, this is the Studhoff camp, you can see that here he's described as a Jew, and all of his biographical information. And here it says he's a Latvian political Jewish prisoner. Studhoff really was the worst transfer for Boris and his father. Boris talks at length in the memoir about two scenes he remembers, which you see here, which are just incredibly chilling artworks in this really unnatural blue hue. Here was a hanging. This was someone who had basically talked back to an SS officer. The entire camp was awoken to watch as this person was hanged. And here are two Russian prisoners who are humiliated by being forced to stand guard, and that meant holding broomsticks and wearing buckets on their heads for hours on end. And then again, here's Boris's card, a little bit more filled out actually, with tons of information about, you know, his face and the way he looks and what's shape of his face and what color eyes does he have and how is his nose, how are his teeth, and again, a political Latvian Jewish prisoner. So liberation comes 1945, April 1945. Boris and his father are in Buchenwald in a satellite camp named Magdeburg. And as the Allies were closing in, there's murmurings, Boris gets a tip that he should escape because they're going to evacuate the camps in a forced death march, the Nazis are. So Boris does that. He escapes without his father, and he hides out in a building in town on the top floor, and that's the perspective of this painting. Of course, this is being a liberation scene of sorts. It does not really have a joyful feeling in any way, certainly still one of intense anxiety and fear of this moment. He narrowly avoided being recaptured, which would have almost certainly resulted in death, but he didn't. And when the Americans had officially come and liberated the camp, Boris walked back to the camp, completely, exhilarated and out of his mind, sort of, and he arrives, and he's hoping to find his father, and he falls into this deep fever sleep. 3 days later, he awakes to see his father standing over him, and his father says, "Dummy, where have you been?" All's well, though. So, Boris's eldest sister, Asya, who is older enough than him that she had gotten married before the war to an Italian man, and then they too had gone to the United States before the war. She survived, of course, in the United States, and she gets word that her father and brother are still alive. This is the original letter that she wrote to a friend in Palestine saying, can we have some of your diplomatic assistance to help, square my brother and father away? It's a beautiful letter. It's an amazing artifact that we get to show in the exhibition, and not as a reproduction. This is something I love to. Just after liberation, Boris and his father are photographed, for kind of identification and displaced persons camp and makeshift passports and everything, and they're photographed wearing the same jacket that they shared. Boris got fairly lucky. His brother-in-law was in the counterintelligence corps in the United States Army, and Boris, given his incredible multilingualism, got a role as an interpreter in the counterintelligence corps in the U.S. Army. So he did that for about 10 months in 1945 and 46, and it was a remarkable time for him. He saved his identifications cards, along with having multiple snapshots, you can see in the exhibition, of him really enjoying life as a young man. He meets women, he meets friends, he eats well, he teaches himself how to drive a Jeep. He's sort of there's this quotation he says, "I go from concentration camp slave to the elite victor overnight." And I think it was quite a heady time for him. In June 1946, Boris and Ilya board a ship for New York. And that is really where our artistic story begins. So all the work I've shown you was made after their arrival in New York. This is one of my favorite works in the show. It's kind of, I think, the only self-portrait that we have known Boris to do. And it just has such pathos to it, seeing this young man who's obviously, can only imagine how lost he must feel in a brand new world. So in this section, we see a lot of portraits that Boris makes, not only of himself, and of course we saw the portrait of his mother, but he starts to draw people who are unnamed. I don't know who they are. I tried at first to sort of match them up with people he might have been describing in his memoir. But kind of no matter. These were people either he remembers from his experience in the war, maybe they're new friends from New York. This might be a girlfriend that he had in Germany. But it just feels like this kind of repopulation exercise. You know, who is around him and who does he have in his world? Or who has he lost in his world? These are two of my favorite portraits. I love the way they're on the diagonal. Okay, so moving on, ambivalence, coming back, doubt, contradiction, irresolution, this kind of emotional confusion and emotionality to explore. Something I picked up on fairly early in looking through the war series was this repeated motif, or this repeated gesture that I kept seeing of an outstretched arm. Now here, it sort of looks like quite a longing and loving gesture, while here it feels more like perhaps someone's being shot, or escaping or requesting some sort of assistance. Throughout, there is this kind of real ambiguity about what the gesture means. I'll show you a few more. But this was something I thought about in connection. Of course, this is Goya's The 3rd of May. Goya also, you know, of course, a critic of war, and this kind of indelible image that a lot of us do know of this person with his splayed arms before the firing squad. But the arm is really kind of bizarre in certain ways, too. I mean, I was struck at how nonchalant it almost appears in some of these. You know, does this look like this person is stopping this man from coming forward? This sort of maybe looks like a dance. This one, maybe a shrug. It's hard to say. But I wanted to read you the label that I wrote around this because I think it's sort of interesting to think about a couple of the various meanings. This context recalls the famed passage in Passover liturgy, "With a mighty hand and an outstretched arm did God take us from that place." Meanwhile, I think, you know, you have the antithesis of that in the Heil salute, in Hitler's salute, which is also an outstretched arm. So the outstretched arm containing at once hate and desire, brutality and deliverance, dancing and dying, I think coheres with the conflicted and contradictory emotions of survival for Boris. I wanted to bring in too, this is a painting by El Greco, just getting back to this idea of deliverance. This is called The Vision of St. John. It's at the Metropolitan. I wanted to pose it with this work that we already saw on the left, which is the prisoners, the same kind of almost exact same color and the elongated figures. It's really interesting to see this reference being made. I've had questions, you know, how much did Boris know of other artists? It's pretty unclear to me. I do think once he arrived in New York and he wanted to be an artist, he immersed himself as much as he could, learning about the masters if he hadn't already been exposed. And here's another sort of visual doppelganger of that outstretched arm gesture. I'll take a sip of water for that. So just nearby this in the exhibition and moving on, the next section really deals with dreams and nightmares. We've already talked about how the war series really projects this kind of nightmarish quality, this kind of surreal vision, which of course makes sense. Everything was completely upside down. Everything about the Holocaust was so unreal. So Boris, just as a person, was really preferred the night. He slept mostly during the day, he worked at night, and he went out at night. He said later in his life this was absolutely a holdover from the Riga ghetto and his imprisonment there, and imprisonment later places too, where it was safer to go out at night. This is one of the most monumental canvases, or I should say the biggest canvas in the show, which is just so incredibly haunting. You can see it was made in 1971, so almost 30 years after the majority of the work in the show was made, but you can see this obviously is a theme that sticks with him, and a style that sticks with him. Here's another concentration camp prisoners. What we haven't really looked so much at yet is how much archival material from Boris's personal archive is in the show. I was really proud of the chance to get to include a lot of this work. Boris kept so much stuff. He had his own kind of chaotically disorganized way, well, organized, disorganized way of dealing with all of these materials. And he was a prolific writer. We have 2 of his diaries on view, which are absolutely incredible artifacts. Unfortunately, they are far too fragile, really, to obviously be able to flip through. But I got to do that, and it was an incredibly intimate experience. And really, again, just highlights this confusing moment, this emotionally turbulent and very ambivalent moment. So I picked out just 2 of the things that are in these diaries, which are bursting with written texts and everything else, and they're 2 poems. Is it a shame? Song of the prisoners, the church bells were ringing, when the first of the Huns came in and the first beasts were being killed. Behind the fence, there was death and madness and lust and love and the certainty of ruin and the flaming hope of life and liberty. The end of countless martyrs, like the sand on the beach, the countenance of the executioner, the face of the unaffected, indifferent, and the growing animal in the affected, that almost likened ladder to the executioner, and the passion of a few on the outside, ready to help, even by the cost of their own lives. And this is just on page whatever of his diary, hidden for kind of nobody to see. It's so unbelievable. This is sort of in a I would say a low-key way, one of my favorite works in the show, and that's mostly because of the title. The title is The Way of Liberty, ? And that just feels like kind of a larger question or quest for him more generally. What was the way to be free? Even though he was a free man in the United States, it likely felt like he would never be free. And talk about a menacing landscape here. And the back turned. More nightmarish images, particularly often of women. This work, just in my own interpretation, really has a relationship to the earlier portrait of his mother. I'll put them side by side. Hold on a sec. It's not necessarily immediately obvious, but something I kind of looked into a little bit was this frame. It could be a doorway, could be anything, but part of me felt like this was an animation of what was inside this frame kind of coming to life. And it was no longer the kind of lovely portrait of his mother, but something far more menacing. I invite you to make your own interpretations, of course. but if this was the cherished memory, this could be something more of the nightmare inherent in that level of grief and level of guilt. And to that point, another page is from his diary where he writes about so many dreams he's having. So the connection to dreams and nightmares is really very evident, because he basically devotes an entire diary to a dream diary. And he writes about all these dreams that he has where he's back in the camps, he's being chased, he's really dealing with that memory. And here, I'll just read another passage. I left mother to her fate somewhere to attempt to make the escape by myself, running out of Germany to France. Something in the forest. Realization, what is the point of running if what I am running to is a controlled border station? The cards are stacked. In border station, there is still a chance. People with documents, some of them perhaps phony ones, still do cross, and it is not so impossible after all to run from Germany to France. And in the margins, which you can see here, he writes, happiness is not impossible. Even some guilty ones make it. I am guilty for mother and for being insincere artist. So, next pillar then is advocacy. And I chatted briefly about that, the writing he did, the research he did, the legacy making he did. First, I want to mention then, in 1975, so nearly exactly 30 years after he had left Riga during his imprisonment, he goes back. He goes back to visit Riga, and it is an incredibly difficult and transformative experience for him. He visits the Rumbula Memorial Site, which is an official memorial site as laid out by the Latvian government, but really does not do justice whatsoever, not that one could, as a visitor's site. What he does is he has a tourist camera with him and he takes photographs. And he writes in his memoir, then with trembling hands I take photos, amateurishly draw a map, measure every grave in length and width by footsteps and mark it all down. So in addition to these photographs, which are frankly quite bad, they're blurry, but they speak so much to what Boris was dealing with at that very moment, which makes them incredible artifacts. He originally produced them in color when he got back. He made them copies in black and white. We have versions of both in the show. Here's the plaque, which just says, in memory of the victims of fascism. It doesn't really elaborate. And these maps, this is what he was talking about. This is the stationery from the ship that he took over from New York to Moscow before arriving in Riga, and he kept the stationery with him, and while he was there at Rumbula, he marked down the maps, and he made a map marking down all of the graves there. In a way, of course, this is a way of Boris sort of concretizing what was really just this abstract notion of where his family was and what it meant for them to be there and what it meant for him to have abandoned that space. Just nearby in this section is the very last artwork that Boris ever made in his life. It's a series of sculptures of wooden stumps with axes driven into them. This is from 2003. He died in 2008, January 2008. So he's almost 80 years old, and you can imagine the labor it would have taken to make these artworks, which in my mind are kind of course, have this reminiscence with the Rumbula forest and the trees there. And in addition, probably make reference to the fact that he chopped wood as a prisoner in the ghetto to warm the homes of German officers. That was one of his jobs. He would do that overnight. So I like ending on this, or not ending the show necessarily, but bringing it around to this kind of final act of catharsis that shows you the way he's still and will never let go of everything that he's dealing with. So we come back to just give you a sense of what's in the cases here as well. The ship stationery, Boris is writing. He begins to kind of scribble notes for his memoir already when he's just in a kind of weeks after his visit. This is what becomes his memoir. I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Now that you're interested Boris Lurie fans, but also in general, it's just a really beautiful read. He's a beautiful writer. And the Advocacy takes over here. He really is a totally idiosyncratic personality. This is a completely eloquent treatise on Latvian anti-Semitism that he wrote on a napkin. He joins two societies, the Jewish Survivors of Latvia and the Survivors of the Riga Ghetto, which are two associations based in New York. He receives, I think it's either monthly or quarterly newsletter that he very often scribbles with this much commentary. There is the editor of, or I should say the president of this society said, "Mr. Lurie, we always welcome your incisive comments." And what he's talking about here is the ways in which the Latvian government had completely whitewashed their history of collaboration with the Nazis. Boris recounts how it was actually his Latvian neighbors who were doing most of the arrests, who were part of the auxiliary groups who were assisting the Nazis in the mobile killing units. He is absolutely adamant that this be recognized. He even takes it upon himself to write to the leadership of Israel at the fall of the Soviet Union to say, don't let them get away with not recognizing their crimes against the Jewish people when they establish their independent government. He also is doing his own research about classmates who he lost in the murders. He is doing research on his girlfriend, Luba. He's writing on more napkins. And what's so interesting, too, is here he writes, I don't know if you can see it, but it says, with this list, he goes, larger list is at 6th Street on napkin written in red. So he actually files away these napkins as legitimate archival material. And we get to show so much of it here, which is really remarkable. Now, all of this is sort of anchored or backgrounded by these giant, in the exhibition, by these giant images of his studio. And his studio, to me, is really kind of this mirror of his mind, this mirror of his person. First of all, it's incredibly messy. He preferred to live in a very disheveled way. He preferred to live in hovels. He called this his New York surrogate ghetto. You can imagine he's going out in the darkness. He lives this way. He doesn't need to. He's actually made a lot of money through New York real estate and penny stock investments, and he just elected to. But we'll see some familiar images on these walls. Coming back here to the image we saw earlier. And then we have his girlfriend Luba, his sister Jana, and the column of workers marching in the Riga ghetto. Now these are all with him in his studio at the very end of his life. And just the very last quotation attached to this photograph of his sister. Now I understand why Riga, and this was when he arrived to Riga and to Rumbula. Now I understand why Riga has lost all its vivacious beauty, class, and glamour. My sister Jana isn't there anymore, not even her memory. No, Jana, I did not even feel you there at Rumbula. That place is too dreary for you. You must have flown away to a friendlier clime. So the show ends with this slightly more joyful and exuberant note, which is a kind of show within a show in a certain way, which gives you a sense of the other art that Boris was making, it basically in the 50s. And New York in the art world, New York in the 50s was the center of the art world. He's immersed in all of this. He goes to the Art Students League. He studies with, incredibly well-regarded masters, although briefly. He basically decides he doesn't like any of it. But in the meantime, he tries a little bit of everything on. He actually has some tiny version of success, not necessarily commercial, but he does show in one-man shows as well as group presentations. And there are certain themes that continue to preoccupy him, of course, mostly dealing with depictions of women, which makes sense given the way his early relationships with women were so violently severed. So this, you have a little kind of abstract expressionist. This feels a little cubist. This has a kind of Munch vibe. Often you really see a lot of lonely figures. This is the outcast here. He starts with collage as well, which becomes very important for him later. And he continues with a theme often of three women, which he very directly said was my mother, my girlfriend, my sister at Rumbala. It's this trinity of women that keeps reappearing in his work. It has a very Matisse kind of feeling. And lastly, this is one of my favorite works, with the outstretched arm coming back and the three women. And Boris can kind of do it all. So again, it's like he's this human being. He's trying so much out. It makes him, I think, really increasingly dimensional to understand this artwork at the end of the show after you've kind of been through his biography and experience with him. And that's it. Thank you.
If anyone has questions for Sara,
Yeah, we have questions. Do we have a mic?
we can. Oh, you can repeat your question into the live stream so people can hear it online.
Okay, yeah. So just project your questions, please.
Okay, so I must say I'm very impressed how you elevated some of Boris's art onto the level of El Greco and Goya. Okay. You mentioned what he did for a living. He made a lot of money in real estate, and so he was a business savvy as well. This was really like this was sort of like the not the subconscious. The art was not, but it was his memories of the war. How he expressed. Had he not been a Holocaust survivor, he may have been more of an allegory. I mean, do you feel that or was this a necessary acting out of his trauma, PTSD
Right.
expression?
So the question is sort of, if we can imagine Boris as an artist, perhaps not so informed by his experience and his trauma, what could we imagine? I mean, it's a great question, and I think at this point it's fairly impossible to divorce him from his experience and from his trauma. I think on the artistic side, and this really you see in a lot of his later work too, in addition to this kind of experimental phase of his, he's just perennially dissatisfied and disappointed and feels very misunderstood by the art world and by the commercial art world. He thinks its value system is really backwards and broken. So the way that he wants to make art is a little bit of kind of achieving some self-satisfaction and self-fulfillment that he really is never able to find. So the activity or the exercise of really working through a lot of his trauma, perhaps through artwork, doesn't necessarily feel like a style unto himself, just something he couldn't help but do. And in general,
That you should write about what you best know, what you experienced. So that's what he did.
yeah,
He produced art based on what he experienced.
right.
But he didn't feel competent enough to, or talented enough to do it commercially, to try to.
Well, I think that he did try. He tried. And to go back to the title, nothing to do but to try. He did try. His heart wasn't really in it because things is quite special. But yeah, he didn't quite make it. That's what there is to say. I'm going to move on to someone else. Can we just move on to someone else? Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Did he ever find love in his life?
Thank you for that. Yes, this is a great and important question. He was married briefly in the 50s. He met a French woman. They had, I think, a kind of amazing love affair that quickly turned quite sour. It was a very volatile marriage. Ended, I think, after 8 to 10 years. The woman who's the president of the Boris Lurie Art Foundation was Boris's lifelong companion. Her name is Gertrude Stein. She's,
Not that good.
no, not that Gertrude Stein. She is, she was basically closest to Boris than anyone in the world. But in a way, it certainly feels like Boris, as he aged, became more and more in love with the idea of his childhood sweetheart, Luba, who reigned over his studio. And I think it was quite difficult for him to have healthy, functioning relationships. Sure.
I was struck by the use of the motif of stripes.
Uh-huh.
You showed at the beginning the stripes in the concentration camp. And as soon as you showed the photo of Boris and his father wearing the same suit jacket, I noticed there were stripes on it,
Yeah.
as well as the older ghostly figure of his mother. She was wearing something with stripes.
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you see that? And if so, what do you make of that?
It's a terrific observation. I didn't see it necessarily. I think it's, maybe there's some combination of mid-century style and a reference, of course, to a striped uniform. I think it's very possible that was indelible for him in a certain way and it just kept being expressed. I think it's a wonderful observation. Yeah.
So after the war, when they came to New York, what happened with his dad? What was his relationship with his father?
So his dad was, again, a really remarkably savvy businessman. They get to New York, and Ilya fairly quickly kind of ingratiates himself in the world of survivors and immigrants from Eastern Europe and starts investing in real estate pretty quickly. He also remarries fairly quickly. So he, I would say, kind of thrived at the same time that Boris sort of floundered. And their relationship was complicated. I think they both had this really, obviously, an immensely important attachment to one another and what they had survived together. But I'm sure there was some way in which they kind of blamed one another for losing the rest of their family members. I think there was a lot of difficulty there in that relationship. What I do know is that Boris's father died in 1964, and Boris kind of plunged into a really deep depression for several years in which he stopped making art, I think, for probably, 3 or 4 years, because it was sort of everyone he had in the world was his father. I think he had a very difficult relationship with his surviving sister, Asya, when he arrived there in New York. I'm going to go all the way in the back.
Has the map of victims of the Holocaust, which were primary?
Very little, I'm sorry to report. It's not been, a little bit, but frankly, there's still a very long way to go. Yeah.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry. The question was, has the Latvian government husband? Yeah, she got married just before the war. They saw the writing on the wall, and they came to the States.
Yeah, 2 sisters.
2 sisters. Yes.
I'm
So this is a great question too. The museum here actually shares a storage space with the warehouse of the Boris Lurie Art Foundation, which I think, you know, there was perhaps some awareness of Boris because his later work, for which he's best known, although you're absolutely right to say he's not actually well known, is still very inflected by the Holocaust. And it's very radical and very confrontational. And the way that it's usually exhibited is without much of this early context, without as much of the biography that really underpins what is that artwork. So, you know, kind of the stars aligned in all of these ways. There was some serendipity and some kind of previous interests that came together for this to be the right time.
Who kept all this art? Who got it all together in the first place?
This is a great question, too. So the Boris Lurie Art Foundation, Boris kind of endowed this foundation in his name, and he said, this is what I want to happen. I want to set up this foundation. I want this. This is the structure of my estate. There was not somebody named to oversee the estate. He didn't have any direct descendants. So there were immense legal battles after his death because a judge, goodness for Gertrude Stein. Yes.
First, I just want to make a comment and to thank you. I think to be entrusted with anything to do with the Holocaust is almost a sacred responsibility. And to have interpreted and shared this with this audience and the larger audience is truly a gift, and I want to thank you for making it so special. And I also want to ask you, what was it like for you as a curator and as just a person to be immersed in all of this material? I got a sense, I mean, you sort of left us with something kind of uplifting, but I imagine it must have taken you through a lot, and just wonder what was that experience like emotionally as well as academically?
Thank you for that question. It's, you know, every show, of course, becomes such a personal experience and adventure and journey that you go on, and this even more so, of course, having to imagine and put myself in the shoes of someone going through this. I have to say, you know, in order to get through the work, you do have to desensitize to it, of course. You know, I gave a presentation the other week, and someone at the end commented, well, gosh, this is so sad. And I said, oh, right, of course, yes, it is. It's so sad, but I have sort of disconnected from that just to be able to get through it. You know, I like to think that the title of this show, I don't think I spoke about it, but Nothing to Do But to Try, really gives you a sense of Boris's resilience. Of course, you can look at all the heartbreak and all the grief, and there's so much of that to go around in this story. But that's actually words from his own memoir. So he's really, you know, signaling his perseverance and his resilience, and that's the uplifting note. That was the way to get through it. That was the way to look through all his archives, is just sort of understanding this person who's in so many ways very, very funny, and the humanity of all of that, like that he's writing on napkins and saving, you know, all of that I really connected to just in a very human way.
He had talent. He definitely had talent. He might not have been at El Greco, but he did have talent.
Well, most certainly, yeah. His work's amazing. Yeah.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time, and thank you so much for your generous.
Thank you. Thank you, Tori.
As members, you're welcome to explore the exhibition until 8 o'clock tonight, so the museum is yours. I think Locks is open as well, and our gift shop if you'd like to take a look at his memoir. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It was interesting how you divided into 3 pillars. That was